When Arjun and I first laid eyes on the old colonial-style house at the edge of town, I knew it was meant to be ours. It was a dream come true, a place where we could start the next chapter of our lives together. The house was filled with charm and character, from the intricate woodwork to the sprawling garden that seemed to stretch endlessly. Sure, it had been unoccupied for years, and the signs of neglect were everywhere: the peeling paint, the creaky floorboards, and that unmistakable musty smell that comes with age. But to us, it was perfect, a canvas waiting for us to bring it back to life. I'm an artist, and I fell in love with the house the moment I saw it. I could already picture the large, airy rooms filled with my paintings, the walls adorned with colors and textures that would reflect our personalities. Arjun was just as excited, though his mind was more on the practical side. He saw the potential for a beautiful home once we finished the renovations. We moved in with all the enthusiasm in the world, eager to transform the old house into something new, something ours. The first few weeks were a blur of activity. We had contractors in and out, taking measurements, making plans, and getting the place ready for the big changes we had in store. Shortly after we settled in, Arjun had to leave for a week-long business trip. It wasn't unusual for him to travel, and I was looking forward to having some uninterrupted time to focus on my art. I had already set up my studio in one of the rooms that was flooded with sunlight during the day, and I was ready to dive into my work. The first night Arjun was gone, I slept like a log, exhausted from all the work we had been doing. The house was quiet, almost too quiet, except for the occasional creak from the old wooden floors. I figured it was just the house settling, nothing out of the ordinary. The next day I spent hours painting, completely lost in my work. It wasn't until late evening that I finally stopped to grab something to eat and relax. As I settled into bed with a book, I heard a faint noise coming from above. It was a soft, almost gentle thumping, like something being moved around slowly. I paused, trying to figure out what it was, but the sound stopped just as suddenly as it had started. I brushed it off as the house settling again. After all, old houses make noises, right? I soon drifted off to sleep, convincing myself there was nothing to worry about. But the following night, the noise returned, and this time it was louder. It started as a soft rustling and grew into a distinct thudding that seemed to come from the attic, directly above my bedroom. It was persistent, and it sent a chill down my spine. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to reassure myself that it was just the wind or maybe the old pipes making noise, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. The next morning I mentioned the noises to the contractor. He shrugged it off, saying it was probably just the house settling or some old beams shifting. His casual attitude didn't do much to calm my nerves, but I decided to let it go. After all, the house was old, and old houses are bound to have their quirks. As the week went on, the noises grew louder and more frequent. The thuds and rustlings were no longer just background noise, they were becoming impossible to ignore. It felt like something or someone was moving around in the attic. I started to feel anxious, dreading the evenings when the house would fall silent, except for those ominous sounds from above. One evening, after another restless night, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. The noises were too regular, too deliberate to be just the house settling. I had to find out what was causing them. I waited until the contractors had left for the day, leaving me alone in the house, and then I made my way up to the attic. The attic door was old and heavy, and I hesitated before turning the rusty knob. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow staircase that led up into the darkness. A cold draft hit me as I climbed the stairs, the air thick with the scent of dust and age. At the top, I fumbled for the light switch, my heart pounding in my chest. The single bulb hanging from the ceiling flickered to life, casting eerie shadows across the attic. It was a large space, filled with old furniture, boxes of forgotten belongings, and layers of dust that had settled over the years. I stepped cautiously into the room, my eyes scanning the clutter for any sign of what could be causing the noises. As I moved deeper into the attic, Something caught my eye, a section of the wall that looked different from the rest. The wood paneling was newer, less weathered, as if it had been added at a later time. Curiosity got the better of me, and I approached the wall, running my hands along the seams. To my surprise, I found a small, concealed latch hidden in the woodwork. With trembling fingers, I pulled the latch, and a portion of the wall swung open, revealing a hidden room. The air inside was stale, and the dim light from the attic barely penetrated the darkness beyond. I hesitated for a moment before stepping inside, my breath catching in my throat as I took in the sight before me. The room was small, no larger than a walk-in closet, and filled with relics from the past. An old rocking chair sat in one corner, its wood worn and cracked. A dusty mirror, its glass clouded with age, hung on the wall, reflecting the dim light in a distorted, ghostly way. Shelves lined the walls, crammed with old books, faded photographs, and strange trinkets that looked like they belonged to another time. But it was the items on the table in the center of the room that truly caught my attention. A collection of worn, leather-bound journals lay open, their pages yellowed and brittle. Next to them was a small, intricately carved wooden box, its lid slightly opened. I felt a chill run down my spine as I approached the table, a sense of foreboding settling over me. I picked up one of the journals, its cover cracked and fragile, and began to read. The handwriting was neat but faded, the ink barely legible in places. As I flipped through the pages, I realized that the journal belonged to a woman who had lived in the house decades ago. The entries detailed her life, her joys, her sorrows, her fears. But as I read on, the tone of the journal changed. The entries became darker, more frantic, as if the woman was slowly losing her mind. The last few entries were particularly disturbing. The woman wrote about hearing strange noises in the house, much like the ones I had been hearing. She described a growing sense of dread, a feeling that something was watching her, waiting for the right moment to strike. The final entry was short, just a few sentences scrawled in a shaky hand. I have found the source of the noises. It is in the attic. I fear I have unleashed something terrible. God help me. My hands trembled as I closed the journal, my mind racing. The noises, the hidden room, the woman's journal, it all seemed too real, too immediate. I glanced at the wooden box on the table, a sense of dread washing over me. Slowly I reached out and lifted the lid. Inside the box was a collection of small, macabre objects: a lock of hair, a tiny, worn-out doll, a rusted key, and what looked like old, faded photographs. The photos were of a family: mother, father, and a young girl, all smiling happily at the camera. But as I flipped through them, I noticed something unsettling. In each successive photo, the family looked more and more haggard, their expressions strained, their eyes filled with fear. The final photograph was of the mother, the woman from the journal, standing alone in the attic, her face pale and haunted, her eyes wide with terror. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared at the photograph, my mind struggling to make sense of what I was seeing. The realization hit me like a cold wave: the noises, the hidden room, the relics, it was all connected. The woman in the journal had found something in the attic, something that had driven her to the brink of madness. And now, it seemed, I had stumbled upon the same dark secret. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the attic, snapping me out of my thoughts. The sound came from the far corner of the room, where the shadows seemed to gather and swirl. I felt a surge of fear, my instincts screaming at me to run, to get out of the house as fast as I could. But something kept me rooted to the spot, a morbid curiosity mixed with a growing sense of dread. The shadows in the corner began to shift, coalescing into a dark, menacing form. My breath caught in my throat as I realized that I was not alone. The air grew colder, and the faint smell of decay filled my nostrils. The figure moved towards me, slow and deliberate, its presence suffocating. I stumbled backward, my heart racing, but my legs felt like lead. I wanted to scream, to call for help, but no sound escaped my lips. The figure loomed closer, its features becoming clearer in the dim light. It was the woman from the photographs, her face twisted in an expression of rage and despair. Her eyes, once filled with fear, now glowed with an unnatural, malevolent light. The woman reached out to me, her icy fingers brushing against my skin. I felt a jolt of terror, a coldness that seeped into my bones. "You shouldn't have come here," she whispered, her voice low and filled with anguish. "You've unleashed it. The curse. It's too late." I tried to pull away, but her grip was too strong. The room around me seemed to spin, the walls closing in, trapping me in a nightmare from which there was no escape. I struggled to break free, my strength draining away with each passing second. Just when I thought I would be consumed by the darkness, the attic door slammed open, and a beam of light cut through the gloom. The figure recoiled, her form dissipating like smoke in the wind. I fell to the floor, gasping for breath, my body shaking uncontrollably. I looked up to see Arjun standing in the doorway, his face pale and filled with concern. "Maya. Are you okay?" he shouted, rushing to my side. I could barely nod, my mind reeling from what I had just experienced. Arjun helped me to my feet, his arms wrapped protectively around me. Together we fled the attic, leaving the hidden room and its dark secrets behind. As we reached the safety of the living room, I collapsed onto the couch, tears streaming down my face. Arjun held me close, whispering soothing words as I tried to process what had just happened. I told him everything: the noises, the hidden room, the journals, the apparition. Arjun listened, his expression growing more serious with each word. "We need to get out of here," he finally said, his voice firm. "Whatever is in this house, it's not safe. We can't stay here." I nodded, too exhausted and shaken to argue. We packed a few essentials and left the house that night, driving to a nearby hotel. As we pulled away from the old, colonial-style house, I couldn't help but glance back, my heart heavy with a mix of relief and sorrow. The house, once filled with the promise of a new beginning, now stood as a reminder of the darkness that had been lurking within its walls all along. We never returned to the house. The renovations were left unfinished, the contractors paid off and dismissed. Arjun and I moved into a new home, one that was bright and modern, with no history to haunt us. But the memories of that night in the attic stayed with me, a constant reminder of the horrors that can be hidden in even the most ordinary places. And sometimes, late at night, when the world was quiet and still, I lie awake, listening to the creaks and groans of our new house. I remind myself that it's just the house settling, nothing more. But deep down, I know that some secrets are better left undiscovered, and some doors should never be opened. It all started on a crisp autumn morning, one of those days where the air is cool and everything feels just a little more alive. I was out for a stroll, trying to clear my head. Life had been weighing me down lately. Work was relentless, and the recent breakup had left me feeling adrift, like I was just going through the motions without any real purpose. My morning walks had become a kind of therapy, a way to sort through the thoughts that seemed to swirl endlessly in my mind. I didn't have a particular destination in mind that day, but as I wandered through a quiet residential neighborhood, something caught my eye: a small garage sale, the kind that pops up randomly on weekends. Normally I wouldn't have bothered stopping, but there was something about the scene that drew me in. Maybe it was the old woman sitting behind the table, knitting quietly, or perhaps it was the large, antique mirror propped up against the house. The mirror was what really grabbed my attention. It was unlike any mirror I'd seen before: large, with a frame made of dark, almost black wood, intricately carved with swirling designs that seemed to shift in the light. The glass, despite its obvious age, was clear and free of the usual distortions you'd expect. I found myself standing in front of it, mesmerized. It wasn't just the craftsmanship that intrigued me, though that was undeniably impressive. There was something else, something I couldn't quite put my finger on: an aura, maybe, or a sense that this mirror had a story to tell, one that was both fascinating and unsettling. The old woman looked up from her knitting as I examined the mirror. She didn't say anything at first, just watched me with a knowing expression, like she understood what had drawn me to it. Finally, I turned to her and asked how much it was. "It's a fine piece, isn't it?" she said, her voice soft but carrying a weight that made it sound like more than just small talk. "That mirror has seen a lot in its time, more than you or I could ever imagine." I nodded, feeling a shiver run down my spine at her words, though I couldn't quite explain why. How much I asked again. She named a price that was surprisingly low, almost as if she were eager to be rid of it. I didn't hesitate. I handed over the money, and she accepted it with a nod. But before I could leave, she looked at me with a seriousness that made me pause. "Be careful with it," she said, her tone almost warning. "It's an old mirror, and it's seen things. Sometimes it's better to let the past stay in the past." I didn't know how to respond to that, so I just nodded and took the mirror to my car. It was heavy, but I managed to fit it into the back seat without too much trouble. As I drove home, I couldn't shake the feeling that the woman's words had been more than just idle chatter, but I quickly dismissed it as nothing more than an old woman's superstitions. Still, there was a nagging doubt at the back of my mind, one that I couldn't quite shake. When I got home, I brought the mirror inside and set it against the wall in my living room, figuring I'd find a permanent spot for it later. It looked even more striking in my home, the dark wood contrasting sharply with the lighter tones of my furniture. As I stood there, looking at my reflection in the glass, I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of satisfaction, like I'd finally brought something into my home that truly belonged. It was as if the mirror had been waiting for me, just as much as I had been waiting for it. That night, after a long day at work, I settled onto the couch with a glass of wine, ready to unwind with a movie. The mirror still hadn't found its permanent place in my home, but I'd propped it up against the wall near the TV, thinking it added a touch of elegance to the room. The light from the TV flickered off the glass, creating an almost hypnotic effect, but I was too absorbed in the film to notice it first. It wasn't until I saw something move out of the corner of my eye that I glanced toward the mirror. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, the way the shadows shifted as the images on the screen changed, but then it happened again. A flicker of movement, just at the edge of my vision. I turned my head fully to look at the mirror, but all I saw was my own reflection staring back at me, the room behind me exactly as it should be. I shook my head, laughing softly at my own imagination. "You're just tired," I muttered to myself, turning back to the TV. But even as I tried to focus on the movie, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Every so often I would catch another flicker of movement in the mirror, something just outside my line of sight, but every time I looked directly at it, there was nothing there. Eventually, I chalked it up to my eyes playing tricks on me and decided to head to bed, leaving the movie unfinished. But as I walked past the mirror on my way to the bedroom, I thought I saw something strange in the reflection just for a split second. I thought I saw someone else standing in the room behind me. I spun around quickly, my heart pounding, but the room was empty. I laughed nervously, shaking my head. "You're being ridiculous," I told myself firmly, forcing myself to walk to my bedroom without looking back at the mirror. It was just an old piece of furniture, nothing more. But as I lay in bed that night, my mind wouldn't let it go. I kept replaying the moment in my head, convinced that what I had seen was real, even though I knew it couldn't be. It was just the shadows, the light from the TV, the wine, anything but what my mind was trying to convince me of. The next morning, I woke up feeling more tired than usual, my sleep having been plagued by strange dreams I couldn't quite remember. As I went about my morning routine, the mirror loomed large in my thoughts. I wasn't sure why, but I felt a growing unease about it, as though it were more than just a piece of furniture. But I pushed the thoughts aside, convincing myself that I was being irrational. I'm a logical person, after all, not someone who believes in ghosts or the supernatural. Still, I couldn't help but feel a slight shiver when I passed the mirror on my way out the door, avoiding looking at my reflection. As the days passed, the strange occurrences around the mirror became more frequent. At first it was just small things, shadows that didn't seem to belong, a fleeting glimpse of something in the corner of my eye, a feeling of being watched. But then, the reflections began to change. I would look into the mirror and see the room behind me, but things wouldn't be quite right. Objects would be out of place, or missing entirely, and sometimes there would be things in the reflection that weren't in the room at all. The figures I saw were the most disturbing. They were always there, just on the periphery, never clear enough to make out any details, but unmistakably human. They moved slowly, as if they were shadows cast by people that weren't really there. I tried to ignore it at first, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But as time went on, it became harder and harder to dismiss. I found myself avoiding the mirror, going out of my way not to look at it, but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't escape the feeling that it was watching me. I started to dread coming home, the thought of being alone in the house with the mirror filling me with a deep sense of unease. And yet I couldn't bring myself to get rid of it. Something about it held me in its thrall, as though it had woven itself into the fabric of my life, and removing it would tear something vital from me. The final straw came one night when I, unable to sleep, got up to get a glass of water. As I passed the living room, I glanced at the mirror out of habit and froze. My reflection was standing there, staring back at me, but it wasn't right. The reflection's eyes were darker than mine, almost black, and it was smiling a twisted, malevolent grin that sent a chill down my spine. I stepped closer, my heart pounding, and the reflection moved with me, but there was a delay, a fraction of a second, that shouldn't have been there. And then, to my horror, the reflection raised its hand and waved, the smile widening as it did so. I stumbled back, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. This wasn't possible. This couldn't be happening. I turned and ran out of the room, slamming the door behind me as though that would somehow keep whatever was in the mirror from following me. I didn't sleep at all that night, my mind racing with fear and confusion. I knew now that the mirror was more than just a piece of furniture, but what it was, I couldn't begin to understand. The next morning, as the first light of dawn filtered through the curtains, I made a decision. I had to get rid of the mirror. I couldn't live like this, constantly on edge, fearing what I might see every time I caught a glimpse of my reflection. But when I went to the living room to move it, I found myself hesitating. The mirror stood there, silent and unmoving, but there was something about it that felt almost alive, as though it were aware of me, watching me, waiting for me to make my move. I forced myself to approach it, my hands trembling as I reached out to touch the frame. It was cold, colder than it should have been, and the moment my fingers brushed the wood, I felt a jolt, like an electric shock, run through my body. I jerked my hand back, my heart racing. But I couldn't let myself be scared off. I needed to get rid of this thing, whatever it was. Summoning all my courage, I gripped the sides of the mirror and lifted it, intending to carry it outside and smash it to pieces. But as I lifted it, something strange happened. The room around me seemed to shift, the colors fading to gray, and the air grew thick and heavy, as though I were suddenly underwater. I could feel the mirror vibrating in my hands, the glass shimmering with a strange inner light. And then, before I could react, the mirror began to pull at me, a force I couldn't see but could feel dragging me closer to the glass. I struggled, trying to pull away, but it was no use. The mirror's pull was too strong, and before I knew it, I was falling into the glass, the world around me dissolving into darkness. When I came to, I found myself lying on a cold, hard floor. I groaned, pushing myself up, and looked around. I was in a room that looked exactly like my living room, but there was something off about it. The colors were muted, the edges of everything slightly blurred, as though I were looking at the world through a fogged-up window. And then I saw the mirror, standing in the corner, reflecting the room back at me. But this time there was no reflection of myself. Instead, I saw the figures, the ones I had seen in the mirror before, standing there watching me with their dark, empty eyes. Panic surged through me as I realized where I was. I wasn't in my living room at all. I was inside the mirror. The figures began to move toward me, their bodies twisting and contorting in unnatural ways, and I scrambled back, my heart pounding in my chest. I had to get out. I had to find a way out. But as I turned to run, I found myself facing the mirror once more, the glass now a swirling vortex of shadows and light. I could feel it pulling at me again, and this time I didn't resist. I let it take me, hoping, praying, that it would lead me back to the real world. I woke up in my living room, lying on the floor in front of the mirror. The room was back to normal, the colors and edges sharp and clear. I was back. But as I looked into the mirror, I saw the figures standing behind me, their dark eyes fixed on me, their mouths moving silently as though they were speaking words I couldn't hear. And then, without warning, they vanished, leaving only my reflection staring back at me, pale and shaken. I didn't waste any time. I grabbed the mirror, carried it outside, and smashed it to pieces with a hammer. As the glass shattered, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders, the oppressive atmosphere that had filled my home dissipating like smoke in the wind. But even as I swept up the shards, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, something I couldn't undo. I could still see the figures in my mind, still feel their eyes on me, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't forget the smile of my own reflection, twisted and malevolent, a grin that seemed to promise that this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. And so I moved on with my life, but the mirror's legacy remained. The experience had left a mark on me, a scar that would never fully heal. And sometimes in the dead of night, when the house was silent and the world outside was still, I would catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye. I would turn, heart pounding, only to find nothing there. But deep down I knew the truth. The mirror might have been destroyed, but whatever it had unleashed was still out there, watching, waiting, biding its time. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that one day it would come back for me. I had always considered myself a creature of habit. Moving into the quiet suburban neighborhood was supposed to be a fresh start after my divorce, a chance to live a simple, predictable life. The house I bought was modest but cozy, just the right size for one person, and the neighborhood was exactly what I needed: peaceful, with well-manicured lawns, friendly neighbors, and a sense of security that was comforting. For over a year, I settled into my new life, content with the solitude and the routine I had created for myself. Little did I know that everything would change one night, a night that still haunts me to this day. It was a little after midnight, and I was getting ready for bed. The day had been uneventful, just another workday, followed by a quiet evening spent reading and watching TV. As I pulled back the covers, ready to climb into bed, I heard a noise. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was enough to make me pause. At first I thought it might be the house settling or perhaps the wind outside, but the sound persisted, a soft, rhythmic thumping, as if something was gently tapping against the side of the house. Curiosity got the better of me, and I walked over to the window, peering out into the darkness. At first, everything seemed normal. The street was quiet, the houses were dark, and the only light came from the dim street lamps that cast long shadows across the pavement. But then I noticed something unusual, a figure standing in the yard next door. It was my neighbor, Mr. Thompson. He was an older man, retired, who mostly kept to himself. We had exchanged pleasantries a few times, but I didn't know him well. That night he was standing perfectly still in the middle of his lawn, his head tilted back, staring up at the sky. I watched him for a moment, puzzled. What was he doing out there at this hour, standing motionless like that? Yet Mr. Thompson remained fixed in place, as if transfixed by something only he could see. The rhythmic thumping continued, though I couldn't tell where it was coming from. It was a strange, unsettling moment, and I found myself holding my breath, waiting for something to happen. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Mr. Thompson lowered his head, glanced around as if he had just woken from a dream, and then slowly walked back into his house. The door closed behind him with a soft click, and the neighborhood was silent once more. I stood by the window for a few more minutes, staring at the darkened house, before shaking my head and returning to bed. It was probably nothing, I told myself, just a strange moment, a trick of the night. I tried not to think about it as I drifted off to sleep. The next day, life returned to its usual routine. I got up early, made myself a cup of coffee, and headed out to work. But as I backed out of my driveway, I noticed that Mr. Thompson's house looked quiet, more so than usual. The curtains were drawn, and there was no sign of movement inside. The memory of the previous night flickered in my mind, and I made a mental note to check on him when I got home. The day passed uneventfully, and by the time I returned home, the strange incident had almost slipped my mind. It wasn't until I was pulling into my driveway that I remembered. I glanced over at Mr. Thompson's house and noticed something odd. His car was still in the driveway, but the front door was slightly ajar. That was unusual. Mr. Thompson was meticulous about such things. My earlier curiosity turned to concern. After parking my car, I walked over to my neighbor's house. I hesitated for a moment before knocking on the door, but there was no answer. I knocked again, louder this time, but the only response was the echo of my own knocks in the empty hallway beyond. The door creaked as it swung open a little wider, revealing the dark interior of the house. "Mr. Thompson," I called out, my voice uncertain. I stepped inside, my hand instinctively reaching for the light switch on the wall. The lights flickered on, casting long shadows across the hallway. The house was eerily quiet, almost too quiet. I took a few cautious steps forward, my eyes scanning the hallway for any sign of my neighbor. Everything was in its place, but there was something off about the house. The air was thick with a musty smell, and there was a strange stillness that made my skin crawl. I called out again, but there was still no answer. I walked further into the house, my footsteps echoing on the hardwood floor. The rhythmic thumping sound I had heard the night before seemed to echo in my mind, though it was absent now. As I made my way through the house, I noticed that everything was tidy, as I expected it to be, but there was no sign of Mr. Thompson. The kitchen was spotless, the living room was neat, and there were no signs of a struggle or any indication that something was wrong. But the silence was unsettling. It was as if the house had been abandoned in a hurry, yet there were no signs of disturbance. Finally, I reached the back of the house, where I found the door to the basement slightly ajar. A cold draft wafted up from the dark stairwell, and I hesitated. Something about that basement made me uneasy, though I couldn't put my finger on why. But my concern for my neighbor overrode my fear, and I slowly descended the stairs, my hand gripping the railing tightly. The basement was dimly lit by a single bulb hanging from the ceiling. The room was filled with the usual clutter: old boxes, tools, and gardening supplies. But in the corner of the room, something caught my eye. It was a small wooden box, its lid slightly open. Curiosity once again got the better of me, and I approached the box cautiously. Inside the box, I found a collection of old photographs. They were black and white, yellowed with age, and as I sifted through them, I realized they were all of the same house, Mr. Thompson's house. But there was something strange about the photos. They were all taken from odd angles, some from inside the house, looking out through windows, others from the outside, looking in. The most disturbing photo was the last one. It was a picture of Mr. Thompson standing in his yard, staring up at the sky, just as I had seen him the night before. My heart began to race. I quickly put the photos back in the box and closed the lid. Something was very wrong here. I hurried back upstairs, my mind racing with questions. Where was Mr. Thompson? What was the meaning of those photographs? And why did I feel like I was being watched? As I reached the top of the stairs, I heard a noise behind me. It was faint, but unmistakable the rhythmic thumping sound from the night before. My blood ran cold as I slowly turned around, my eyes scanning the basement for the source of the noise. But there was nothing there, only the darkness and the eerie stillness. I didn't wait to find out what was making the noise. I bolted out of the house, my heart pounding in my chest, and ran back to my own home. I locked the door behind me and collapsed onto the couch, my mind reeling. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong, that I had stumbled onto something I wasn't meant to see. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. I couldn't focus on anything, my thoughts consumed by the events of the day. I tried to call the police, but when they arrived and searched Mr. Thompson's house, they found no sign of him. There was no evidence of foul play, no clues as to where he might have gone. It was as if he had simply vanished. The days that followed were even stranger. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I left the house, I felt eyes on me, unseen but always present. The neighbors seemed to be acting differently, too more distant, more suspicious. It was as if they knew something but were too afraid to speak. Then, one night, the thumping sound returned. I was lying in bed when I heard a soft, rhythmic tapping against the side of my house. My heart pounded in my chest as I got up and walked to the window. The street outside was dark and empty, but as I looked across to Mr. Thompson's house, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The front door of the house was open, and standing in the doorway was a figure. It was Mr. Thompson, or at least it looked like him. But there was something different about him, something wrong. His face was pale, almost ghostly, and his eyes were fixed on my house. He stood there for a moment, unmoving, before slowly stepping back into the shadows and disappearing from sight. I backed away from the window, my mind racing. I knew I wasn't imagining things. Mr. Thompson was back, but he wasn't the same. Something had happened to him, something terrible. And now, whatever had taken Mr. Thompson was coming for me. The next morning, I made the decision to leave. I packed my bags and put my house up for sale, not caring about the financial loss. I didn't tell anyone where I was going, not even my family. I just wanted to get as far away from that place as possible, away from the vanishing neighbor and the house that seemed to hold dark, terrible secrets. As I drove away from the neighborhood, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw Mr. Thompson's house one last time. The front door was closed, the windows dark and silent. But I knew that whatever had happened there wasn't over. It would continue, and whoever moved into that house next would be in for a terrifying surprise. I never spoke of the events that had transpired. I moved to a new city, started a new life, and tried to forget. But some nights when the wind was just right and the world was quiet, I would hear that rhythmic thumping sound in the back of my mind, a reminder of the night my neighbor vanished and the night I was almost taken too.